Fiancée pretended to be paralyzed to fool the billionaire, until the maid's toddler innocently exposed her. Trust me, you won't forget this one. A 29-year-old woman fooled an entire mansion. She fooled the doctors. She fooled the staff. She fooled the man who loved her more than anything in this world. For months she sat in that wheelchair. Silent, fragile, playing the role of her life. And a 33-year-old billionaire. He gave up everything to care for her. He cancelled meetings. He held her hand every single night. He cried alone in the dark because he thought he was losing her. But then, a tiny 3-year-old little girl, a maid's baby, walked into that room one afternoon and said 4 words that made the entire world collapse. Nobody saw it coming. Not even close. Hey, welcome back everyone. If you are new here, this is the place where real human stories come to life. Stories that make you feel something deep inside your chest. Before we begin today, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city and country in the comments below. I genuinely love seeing where our amazing family is tuning in from all around the world. Now listen. Today's story is unlike anything I have ever shared on this channel. It involves love, betrayal, sacrifice, and one tiny innocent moment that changed everything forever. This is the kind of story that will make you question who you trust, and remind you that truth, no matter how deeply someone buries it, always finds a way to the surface. Stay with me. Every single second of this story matters. She looked so fragile sitting there. But something in the back of his mind just wouldn't let go. His name was Nathaniel Cole. Everyone in Chicago called him Nate. At 33 years old, he had built one of the most successful real estate development companies in the entire Midwest. His name was on buildings. His face was in magazines. His phone never stopped ringing. But if you asked Nate what he was most proud of in his life, he wouldn't talk about the money. He wouldn't talk about the penthouse on the 42nd floor or the black card that never got declined. He would talk about Vivian Marsh, 29 years old, dark hair, green eyes, a laugh that somehow made every quiet room feel like it was full of music. Nate had met her 2 years ago at a charity gala downtown. She was volunteering, helping serve food, completely unbothered by the wealth swirling around her. He had walked past her 3 times before finally stopping and saying the most embarrassing thing imaginable. He said, "I think I forgot how to talk to people." And she had laughed that laugh and said, "Lucky for you, I'm a great teacher." They were engaged within 14 months. The ring was simple. Vivian had specifically asked him not to make it flashy. She said she didn't want people looking at her hand. She wanted them looking at her face. Nate had loved that about her more than almost anything else. But then came the accident. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. Vivian had been driving back from visiting her mother in the suburbs when a delivery truck ran a red light and slammed into the driver's side of her car. Nate got the call at 9:47 p.m. He was in a board meeting. He left so fast he knocked his chair backward and didn't even stop to pick it up. By the time he reached the hospital, Vivian was stable. Physically, her injuries were real. A fractured collarbone, deep bruising along her ribs. But the doctors, they kept running tests. And 3 days later, a neurologist sat Nate down and told him something that made his stomach drop through the floor. Vivian, they said, appeared to have lost significant mobility in her lower body. Spinal trauma. Possibly permanent. They would know more with time and continued evaluation. Nate sat in that hallway alone for 2 hours. He didn't call his assistant. He didn't call his lawyers. He called his mother and he cried. He actually cried. A 33-year-old man worth hundreds of millions of dollars, sitting on a plastic hospital chair, crying because the woman he loved might never walk again. He moved Vivian into his mansion the moment she was discharged. He converted the east wing of the house into a full medical suite. He hired round-the-clock nurses. He flew in a spinal specialist from Johns Hopkins. He cancelled a 7-figure development deal in Miami because it would have required him to travel for 3 weeks, and he refused to leave her side for that long. His staff watched all of this quietly. The personal chef, the groundskeeper, the housekeepers. They all saw how deeply this man loved this woman. How he would sit beside her wheelchair every morning with her coffee. How he would read to her at night. How he would wheel her through the garden on Sunday afternoons even in the cold, wrapping blankets around her legs and talking to her about their future. About the house they would build together. About the kids they had laughingly argued about naming. Everyone in that house felt the weight of his devotion. But there was one member of the household who didn't spend much time observing the romance of it all. Mainly because she was 3 years old and far more interested in her collection of plastic dinosaurs than anything else happening in that mansion. Her name was Rosie. Rosie was the daughter of Clara Webb, one of Nate's housekeepers. Clara had worked for Nate for nearly 4 years. She was quiet, hard-working, deeply loyal, and a single mother doing everything she could to raise her little girl right. The mansion had a small staff apartment attached to the east end of the property, and Clara and Rosie lived there. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe and warm, and Rosie didn't know the difference between a mansion and a palace anyway. Rosie had curly red hair and enormous blue eyes and a habit of wandering into rooms she absolutely was not supposed to be in. Clara spent half her working hours keeping track of that little girl while trying to keep the rest of the house in order. Nate never minded Rosie. He actually found her hilarious. She had once walked into a meeting he was having on speakerphone, placed a plastic triceratops directly on top of his laptop, and then walked back out without saying a single word. He had laughed for 5 minutes straight. Vivian, on the other hand, did not find Rosie quite as charming. Whenever Rosie wandered too close to the East Wing, Vivian would tense up. She would ask the nurses to close the door. She would ask Clara, in a very polished and very cold voice, to please keep her daughter on the other side of the house. Clara always apologized quickly, always nodded, always looked slightly ashamed. Nate noticed it. He didn't say much about it. He told himself Vivian was going through an incredibly difficult time and probably just needed quiet. But in the back of his mind, something small and quiet was starting to ask questions. She never let anyone into that room alone. And everyone just accepted it without ever asking why. 3 months passed. The medical team continued their evaluations. The spinal specialist from Johns Hopkins visited twice more, each time reviewing scans and test results with a furrowed brow and careful words. The diagnosis remained what it had been. Limited sensation. Limited mobility. The recommendation was continued therapy, patience, and time. Vivian went through the motions of physical therapy with a quiet kind of resignation that Nate found heartbreaking. She would sit in her sessions, moving her arms, doing the upper body exercises, cooperating fully with everything above the waist. But when the therapist would attempt to work on lower body sensation or stimulation exercises, Vivian would shut down. She would say she was tired. She would say the pain was too much. She would ask to go back to her room. The therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Anaya Simmons, mentioned this pattern gently to Nate during a private check-in. She wasn't accusing Vivian of anything. She simply said that psychological resistance was very common in cases like this. That trauma of this nature affected not just the body but the mind. That Vivian might need emotional support as much as physical therapy. Nate doubled down on his care. He hired a trauma counselor. He bought Vivian an entire studio setup because she had once mentioned she used to love painting. He had the East Wing windows extended floor to ceiling so she could look out at the garden from her chair. He did everything he could think of. And Vivian received all of it beautifully. She was gracious. She was grateful. She would touch his face in the evenings and tell him he was the best man she had ever known. She would cry softly sometimes, and he would hold her, and she would whisper that she was so sorry for being a burden. And every time she said that, Nate would say the same thing. "You are not a burden. You are my whole life. Nothing has changed." The household staff watched all of this. Most of them felt genuine emotion about it. Two of the nurses had privately told Clara they had never seen a man love a woman the way Nate loved Vivian. But Clara herself said very little, because Clara had seen something small. Something that had happened so quickly she had almost convinced herself she imagined it. But she hadn't imagined it. She knew she hadn't. It was a Thursday morning, about 6 weeks after Vivian had moved in. Clara had been walking past the East Wing with a stack of freshly laundered towels. The door to Vivian's private suite was slightly open, maybe 4 inches, and Clara had been about to knock when movement inside made her stop. Vivian was standing, not being lifted, not being assisted, standing, on her own 2 feet, in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting something in her hair. Her back was to the door. She was standing completely straight, shifting her weight slightly from one foot to the other the way anyone would while fixing their reflection. Clara had frozen. Her hand had hovered near the door. And then Vivian must have sensed something, because she turned her head slightly toward the door and Clara had stepped back and quietly moved down the hallway. Her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had told no one. Not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know what she had actually seen. Had it been a hallucination of recovery? Had she misread it? Could Vivian have simply had a spontaneous moment of feeling returning and been too afraid to acknowledge it? Clara was a housekeeper. She was not a doctor. She was not anyone. And the last thing she could afford was to make an accusation against the fiancé of the man who employed her and provided the roof over her daughter's head. So she stayed quiet. She stayed quiet for weeks. But Rosie didn't know any of that. Rosie didn't know about loyalty or consequences or the complicated politics of being a working-class woman inside a rich man's home. Rosie was 3. Rosie knew dinosaurs and crackers and the color yellow and her mama's face. And Rosie, on one perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon in January, pushed open a door she was not supposed to push open and changed absolutely everything. Nobody thought a 3-year-old could break open a secret that a grown woman had hidden for months. But innocence doesn't know how to lie. It happened at 2:17 in the afternoon. Nate was downstairs in his home office on a conference call with his development team in Phoenix. Clara was in the laundry room on the far end of the property. 2 of the nurses were on their scheduled afternoon break. The trauma counselor had left an hour earlier after Vivian's session. Vivian was alone in the East Wing. Or so she thought. Rosie had been sitting quietly in the hallway outside the staff apartment, lining up her plastic dinosaurs in a very specific order that made complete sense to her and absolutely no sense to anyone else. She had been doing this for about 20 minutes, and then she had gotten bored, and then she had decided to go find her mama, and then she had gotten distracted by the long hallway leading to the East Wing because the afternoon light coming through the windows made a pattern on the floor that looked, to Rosie, exactly like a road. So Rosie followed the road. She padded down the hallway in her little socks, one dinosaur still clutched in her left hand, completely silent the way small children sometimes are when they are deeply focused on something that has absolutely nothing to do with what is about to happen. The door to Vivian's suite was not fully latched. Never latched properly. Nate had mentioned it to the property manager twice. It swung open with the lightest push. Rosie pushed it. And what Rosie saw on the other side of that door stopped even her 3-year-old wandering brain completely in its tracks. Vivian Marsh, the woman everyone in this house believed couldn't feel her legs, was doing yoga. Not standing this time. Not just adjusting her hair. She was on a yoga mat laid out across the center of the room, earbuds in, phone propped against the nightstand, moving through a sequence with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this for years. Her legs were extended. She was folding forward. She was pushing up into a position that required full core and lower body strength. She was moving the way someone moves when their body works completely and has never stopped working. Rosie stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she did what 3-year-olds do. She toddled right in and said loudly and clearly, "You can walk." Vivian yanked her earbuds out so fast one of them flew across the room. She spun toward the door. Her face went completely white. She stared at Rosie. Then she lunged for her wheelchair, moving across the room with a speed that only confirmed what Rosie had just announced. "You walk fast," Rosie added very matter-of-factly, watching her with enormous blue eyes. Vivian grabbed the wheelchair, sat in it, and then looked at Rosie with an expression that was no longer gracious or soft or grateful. It was panic, and underneath the panic was something colder. "You didn't see anything," Vivian said. Her voice was different, harder, stripped of the gentle tremor she used around Nate. Rosie blinked. "You were doing exercise," she said. "No, I wasn't. Go find your mama. Right now." Rosie looked at her, then looked at the yoga mat, then looked back at Vivian. "You were," she said simply. And then she turned around and walked back into the hallway. Vivian sat in that wheelchair shaking. Her mind was racing. 3-year-old. A 3-year-old had walked in. Was fine. Was fine. No one would believe a 3-year-old. She just had to stay calm. She just had to manage this. She grabbed her phone and started thinking through her next steps. What she didn't know was that Nate's conference call had ended 4 minutes early. And Nate had been walking toward the east wing to check on Vivian. And Nate had been about 10 feet from the door when a little red-haired girl in socks had walked out of that room, looked up at him with her big blue eyes, held up her plastic dinosaur, and said with absolute 3-year-old sincerity, "Nate, the lady in there can walk. She was doing exercise. I saw." Nate stood very still. "What did you say, Rosie?" "She was doing exercise on the floor," Rosie said. "Her legs worked." The hallway was very quiet. Nate looked at the door. And then he walked to it. And he opened it. What he found behind that door didn't just break his heart. It rewrote every memory he had of the last 3 months. Vivian had managed to get the yoga mat shoved partially under the bed. She was sitting in her wheelchair facing the window when the door opened. She heard his footsteps. She knew before she turned around. But she turned around anyway. And the moment she saw his face, she knew that Rosie had told him. "Nate, stand up," he said. His voice was quiet. That was the thing that terrified her more than anything. Not loud. Not explosive. Quiet. The way a building goes quiet right before something structural gives way. "Nate, I can explain." "Vivian." He looked at her with eyes that were doing something she had never seen them do before. They were grieving. Right in front of her. "Please don't make this worse. Just stand up." The silence stretched for 10 full seconds. And then Vivian Marsh stood up from the wheelchair. She stood up slowly. She stood up straight. She stood on 2 legs that had never stopped working, in a room full of equipment bought by a man who had been crying himself to sleep for 3 months believing he was going to lose her. Nate didn't make a sound. He looked at her standing there. He looked at the wheelchair. He looked at the medical suite he had built. He thought about the specialist he had flown in from Baltimore. He thought about the therapy sessions. He thought about every night he had sat beside her bed holding her hand, terrified, praying she wouldn't deteriorate. He thought about the Miami deal he had walked away from. He thought about calling his mother in that hospital hallway and sobbing. And then he thought about something else. He thought about why. "Why?" he said. And for the first time since he had met her, Vivian Marsh didn't have a beautiful answer. She started crying. Real tears. Maybe the first real ones he had ever seen from her. And through those tears she started talking. The accident had been real. That part was true. The injuries above the waist had been real. But the paralysis, the spinal trauma. She had exaggerated symptoms during the early evaluations. She had researched how to present in ways that would confuse testing. She had been deliberate and calculated from the very beginning. Because Vivian had been terrified. Not of losing the use of her legs. She had been terrified of losing him. 6 weeks before the accident, she had found an email on her own laptop from a mutual friend, telling her that Nate had been seen having dinner twice with a woman from his company's legal team. The email suggested something was happening. That Nate was pulling away. That Vivian should be careful. Vivian had never confronted Nate. She had sat with that terror alone and let it grow into something monstrous. And then the accident had happened. And she had seen the way he ran to the hospital. She had seen the way he looked at her. And in that hospital room, with her real injuries and her real pain, something dark and desperate inside her had thought, this is the only way he'll stay. So she had stayed in the chair. She had constructed an entire false reality to keep a man who, as it turned out, had never been leaving in the first place. The dinner with the lawyer. It was about Nate quietly preparing to update his will to include Vivian after the engagement. He had been trying to surprise her. Nate listened to all of this without moving. When she finished, the room was so quiet you could hear the garden outside. I never looked at anyone else, he said. Not once. Not for a single second. Vivian crumbled. She sank to the floor right there, not in the wheelchair, just on the floor, and she wept in a way that had no performance in it at all. Nate stood there for a long time. Then he walked out of the room. He walked down the hallway. He walked past the staff apartment. He found Clara in the laundry room. Rosie was sitting on the floor next to her now, eating crackers and explaining something very important to her stegosaurus. Nate crouched down to Rosie's level. Hey, Rosie. Rosie looked up. Hi. Thank you for telling me the truth today. Rosie considered this very seriously. Then she held out a cracker. Nate took it. And for just a moment, in that small warm laundry room, something loosened in his chest. He had every reason to walk away forever. But what he chose instead became the most honest moment of his entire life. The next 2 weeks were the quietest the mansion had ever been. Vivian did not leave the East Wing. She didn't ask to. She seemed to understand that the space Nate needed right now was something she had to give him without condition. Several of the nursing staff were quietly thanked and released. The medical equipment sat unused. The wheelchair stayed in the corner of the room like a confession no one needed to read anymore. Nate worked. He took the Phoenix meetings. He called Miami back. He went through the motions of the life he had temporarily abandoned, and everyone around him was careful and quiet and gave him room. Clara continued her work. She never brought up what Rosie had done. She never asked Nate what was going to happen. She just kept showing up every morning and doing her job with the same quiet dignity she had always carried. On the 14th day, Nate knocked on the door of the East Wing. Vivian opened it. She was standing. She would always be standing now. There was something almost painful about it. How normal she looked. How completely whole. "Can I come in?" he asked. She stepped back. He came in and sat in the chair beside the window, the chair he had sat in for 3 months beside her wheelchair. She sat on the edge of the bed. They were both quiet for a moment. "I've been trying to figure out which part hurts the most," he said. "And I think it's not that you lied. I think it's that you didn't trust me enough to just ask." Vivian looked at her hands. "You should have just asked me," he said. "You could have shown me that email. You could have said, Nate, I'm scared. I'm scared you're leaving and I don't know what I'll do. I would have told you the truth. I would have sat with you in that fear." "I know," she whispered. "Do you?" He wasn't angry. He sounded exhausted in the way people sound when they have been carrying grief for a long time. "Because what you did, it took the last 3 months of my life and made them into something I don't know how to look at anymore. Every moment I thought was real. I have to go back and ask myself what was true." Vivian looked up. The love was real, she said. My fear was real. What I felt for you was never fake. I know that too, he said. That's why this is so hard. He was quiet for a long moment. He looked out at the garden. I can't marry you, he said. Not right now. Maybe not ever. Because I need to find out who we actually are when we're both being honest. And I think you need to figure out some things about yourself that have nothing to do with me. Vivian nodded. A tear moved down her face, but she didn't look away this time. But I also can't pretend, he continued, that 2 years of love just disappears. I'm not that person. So I'm asking you to get real help. Not for me. For yourself. And maybe after some time, we can find out if there's anything still here worth building on. Honestly, this time. It was not a fairy tale ending. It was better than that. It was the truth. Vivian left the mansion 3 days later. She started therapy. Real therapy. Not the kind performed for an audience. Nate called his mother. He told her everything. She listened for 40 minutes and then she said, Baby, the fact that you're still standing after all of that tells me exactly who you are. He thought about that for a long time. Clara received a significant bonus that month. Nate also set up a college fund for Rosie, quietly, without making an announcement. He left a note with it that said simply, For the most honest person in this house. Rosie, when Clara tearfully told her about it years later, would say she didn't really remember it happening. She remembered the dinosaur. She remembered the road made of light on the hallway floor. She remembered the crackers. But sometimes the things that change our lives are the smallest, most ordinary moments. Child following the light. A door that doesn't latch properly. For words spoken without agenda, without strategy, without even fully understanding their weight. You can walk. Truth always surfaces. It doesn't matter how deep it's buried or how carefully it's hidden or how long the performance runs. Truth moves like water. Finds the cracks. Seeps through. And one day, in the most unexpected way, through the most unexpected voice, it simply arrives. And when it does, the people strong enough to face it are the ones who get to start over. Really start over. Not with a lie holding the foundation together, but with something solid, something real, something built on the one thing that actually lasts. Honesty. If this story moved you even a little, if it made you think about the walls we build around ourselves out of fear, the lies we tell because we can't imagine being truly seen and still loved, then this story did exactly what it was meant to do. Sometimes we destroy the very thing we're trying to protect. And sometimes a 3-year-old with a plastic dinosaur and no reason to lie is the bravest person in the room. Trust the people who love you enough to tell them the truth. That's the whole lesson. That's all of it. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps more people find stories like this one. Subscribe to this channel if you're new because we put our whole hearts into every single story we share here. And if you know someone who needs to hear a message about honesty and trust and love, share this video with them today. You might not know it, but that share could be exactly what someone needs. Thank you for watching. Thank you for feeling this with me. I'll see you in the next one.